Hello. So this is the second part of the lecture, and I'm going to discuss the last two concepts from the PowerPoints. And the two concepts are biopolitics and Homo sacer. I hope that uh, you're enjoying the lectures. I will also post the PowerPoint slides online. So if you had the chance to attend the in-person lecture, I went over some of the concepts. And next week, when we meet on Tuesday, if you choose to attend, uh, I will deliver the same lecture uh, in person in the lecture hall. That is the recorded lecture. So I'll play the clips and use the PowerPoint as well. So it's up to you whether you attend the in-person class or whether you watch the videos online, but it will be the same PowerPoint and the same article that I will discuss every week in class and also in these recordings. When you are preparing for the take-home test, then you can look at the PowerPoint. So if you were to look at these concepts, they will be short answers. So you will be asked to define these concepts drawing on the reading. And you can also make reference to these PowerPoints as well. So hopefully the test will be clear. You will be given 7 concepts to define, and you have to choose 5. So hopefully will all be clear, but you will have a week as well, and it's an open book test. So you can contact me if you have any questions. And the one thing that you are asked not to do on the test is just to only repeat the material from the reading. So you are asked to define the concept in your own words. You can draw on quotes, but you are asked to give your own definition of the concept. And the test asks you to read and research certain key ideas relating to criminology and also in the liberal arts and humanities. So if you were to write a law school proposal or a graduate school proposal, making reference to this language, I think would be really useful, particularly for graduate school, a master's or PhD program in the liberal arts and humanities. These concepts from Foucault and from Giorgio Agamben are really well cited in the social sciences and liberal arts and humanities. If you were to apply for law school, then citing Mariana Valvardi's article could also be very useful. And Mariana Valvardi is a professor in the Department of Socio-Legal Studies and Criminology. So if you are applying for law school in Ontario, then you might want to cite this scholarship in your proposal. So when you apply for law schools, you will have to give a written statement. So Mariana Vilvardi is a Canadian criminologist and sociologist. She is currently a professor in the Centre for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Toronto. Her research mainly focuses on the sociology of law. She is also an occasional contributor to Spacing Magazine, which is a magazine in Toronto that discusses issues of space and housing, housing justice, and also public space. So biopolitics is a concept from the reading, and I will play this clip about biopolitics from this blog, Theory and Philosophy,
And I know
which is David's blog. And David has a PhD from Western University, and he is a visiting professor now at
welcome everyone to my little
he's a visiting professor in Occidental College's Critical Theory and Social Justice Department.
Hey everyone, back again. Today I'm going to try
about biopolitics.
Explain what biopolitics is according to Michel Foucault. Now, before jumping into that, you can follow me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy if you want to mostly see pictures of my cats. If you want to help me out, you can like, share, subscribe. If you want to help me out monetarily, you can do that with the links below. Obviously, no pressure. If you're listening to this in podcast form, you can find the video on YouTube. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, you should be able to find the podcast form pretty easily wherever you get podcasts. And there shouldn't be ads, at least for now. Who knows? Maybe things will change. But yeah, so that's more or less it. Let's jump into what biopolitics is. So in Foucault's work, he talks about many institutions. He talks about hospitals, he talks about prisons, government, clinics, all of these institutions that permeate our daily lives. And in many ways, these institutions have pretty significant effects on how we live in the world. And he treats them as microcosms of broader systemic phenomena like control. So in the case of the prison, he uses the panopticon to describe the ways in which people are surveyed and how surveillance operates to such an extent that people watch themselves. And if you want more on that, I've done a couple episodes on discipline and punish and one on just the panopticon if you want more on that. So Foucault was trying to think of how these mechanisms kind of unfold in a medical establishment. So the panopticon applies in many of the same ways. Like there is a kind of surveillance mechanism within hospitals. I mean, you're under the view of a doctor or nurse or whatever that maintains your well-being in a kind of strict control-like way. So that's one way to look at it. And I'm not passing a judgment on that, but I think that that's one way we can describe the panopticon working in a medical field. But Foucault also wants to think of how an exertion of power over bodies exemplifies a different kind of power than the one that we find with like the panopticon. So he calls this biopower, which roughly translates to power over life. Bio relating to bios and just referring to life more generally. So what does that mean, biopower? What does it mean to exert power over life? Well, in tracing the development of biopolitics and biopower, he says that it follows anatomopolitics or anatomopower. And this is really chronicled well in I guess The Birth of the Clinic, which I've also done on here, so you can listen to that if you want, where he describes the way that anatomy began to take on a kind of interesting place within the medical field. So it wasn't about like mystical explanations for various bodily ailments. Suddenly, people, that is doctors, began to cut open bodies and look to see how things worked. And that began to develop a new regimen of truth as to what health looked like. Now, he says that biopower follows this because biopower is the extension of a kind of logic of bodies, a knowledge of bodies and how they operate, in consolidating a norm about those bodies. So whereas previously, if someone had an ailment, they were a kind of singular being that would be, evaluated in terms of their a problem they had, and we still see that continue today in terms of their anatomy, of course, like this is what doctors do. But the extension of that logic into the broader social sphere meant that people were judged not only in terms of their anatomy, but in terms of their deviation from a norm about health. Now, where does this norm come from? Well, quite simply, from repetition, from the acknowledgement of certain forms of proper bodies and how they relate to proper size, height, weight, race, um, propensity to give birth, life expectancy. All of these things began to develop a sort of norm. And it's in this way that we can imagine the transition from anatomopolitics to biopolitics. Now, I should say that Foucault discusses this probably the most succinctly within his lectures. But interestingly, if you read the lectures, he often defers discussing biopolitics, choosing instead, not necessarily intentionally, but choosing instead to discuss the kind of governmental changes that allowed the formation of biopolitics and the exertion of biopower. And he credits this with the emergence of liberalism. Now, what do I mean by liberalism? Well, just very basically, liberalism refers to a kind of governmental regime that tries to minimize government while maximizing productivity or control over bodies. So, the logic that we often hear today, especially those coming out of certain conservative circles, is about reducing government size because there is a belief that people, the market, will just regulate themselves, and there is no need for a kind of oversight. Now, Foucault says that this is a very interesting phenomenon in the course of human history because for a long time, living under sovereignty, it was a matter of being told what to do all the time or just being under control. So the shift for him didn't necessarily mark a lessening of control, even though that's the narrative it sells. It tries to tell you that it means less control and it means more freedom. He says that it actually marks the perfection of control. Now, this relates to the idea of the panopticon, where you don't even need to be under surveillance to act properly. You just kind of accept the way you should act because of various power mechanisms that shape you and control you without you necessarily knowing it. So he relates or kind of attributes the emergence of biopolitics to liberalism. Because in the logic of less control, there emerged as well a concomitant belief that the kinds of social interactions, the kind of bodily reactions to this that we would see would be more natural because they weren't being determined by a despot or a ruler of some kind or government. And it is through that that this norm began to emerge because it was associated with a kind of truthfulness, with a kind of reality that was free of coercion, free of control. And this allowed then the establishment of this form of control, not only over people's individual bodies by saying, hey, you have this thing wrong with you because of this problem in your body. What we began to see then was a homogenization of control over all bodies because of their relationship to this, albeit artificial, norm. And all norms are really artificial, but in this case, a kind of norm about life and what certain bodies should look like. Now, it's important to know that this doesn't mean that death has left the equation. And we can contrast this with an idea of necropolitics with the work of Shin Mbembe, who I hope to talk about at some point here. But for now, it's important to note that biopolitics is not, or the form of government that uses biopower has not completely eschewed death. It still lets people die, but it justifies those deaths with a new logic. So, for example, in relation to like fat phobia or fat shaming, when bodies that do not comply with a general standard about what bodies should look like in terms of their height, width, weight, these kind of arbitrary signifiers of health, when bodies do not comply with that, and let's say someone who didn't belong to that, or someone who was quote unquote deviant from the norm, were to die, they would be um, their death would be attributed to their deviation from the norm. So what we see then is not a looking upon someone's body as being, their own body, but them always being determined, even in death, in relation to a norm. And Foucault uses the same logic to consider the emergence of state racism, where under biopolitics, with this emergence of a norm, there could then be the consolidation of an idea of racial purity, which is often associated with a state, especially if we consider that, the way that that is being echoed today in various nations. And certainly the best example would be like with Nazi Germany, where we saw the establishment or the attempt to establish not only this tacit norm, but to put that into legislation, which essentially meant that people who did not fall into that norm, did not fall into that racial norm, would then be either directly punished, and it wouldn't be seen as violence like as it had historically manifested. It would take on a new justification. It would be kind of validated in the eyes of the public because they were sold this idea, not directly, but unconsciously sold an idea that people who deviated from this norm are somehow deserving of whatever befell them. So this also extends to just excluding certain people from the medical establishment. Now, this isn't to say that racialized bodies who are excluded from the medical establishment, or who are just, they aren't heard when they are actually entered into the medical establishment. This isn't to say that we should extend this medical establishment to everyone per se, because this medical establishment is at its core extremely exclusionary, and any attempt to try and increase its scope will always mean that there is some population that is going to be either directly excluded or further pathologized because they do not abide by the norm that this medical establishment implies, or that it revitalizes over and over and over again. And that more or less covers it. If you want more on that, the kind of key texts in his lectures are The Birth of Biopolitics, Security, Territory, and Population. And then in his other books, you have, of course, The Birth of the Clinic. The History of Sexuality is probably the book in which he really develops this. And then, of course, all of his other books kind of relate in some way or other. But yeah, I hope you liked what I had to say. If I did anything wrong, or I said anything wrong, or I mischaracterized Foucault in any way, I would love to hear about it. But yeah, catch you next time.
So biopolitics then is a really interesting concept from Foucault that we can use to discuss many aspects of criminology. And as a criminological theory, biopolitics asks one to consider, or leads one to consider, the relationship between nation building, eugenics, and crime. So, eugenic philosophy was most horrifically used by the Nazis, and the Nazis really wanted to control the birth of the future population. So, eugenics is a theory that, or a set of ideas that often supports the birth of certain children and not others. And eugenics often targets certain groups of women, specifically women who are ethnic minorities or religious minorities and poor women, and tries to prevent these women from having children. So, eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices that aim to supposedly improve the genetic quality of a human population. Um, Historically, eugenicists have altered various human gene frequencies by inhibiting the fertility of people in groups purported to be inferior or promoting that of those purported to be superior. So, the history of eugenics began in the 19th century, and the eugenics movement emerged in the UK and then spread to many countries, including Canada. Um, in this period, people from across the political spectrum espoused eugenic ideas. And the idea of good stock and people who are from good stock is a eugenic idea. And eugenics was also practiced by colonizers. And eugenics is also still practiced today in Canada. So there is currently a class action lawsuit against nurses and doctors throughout Canada who are accused of forcibly sterilizing Indigenous women who give birth to one child. And then many Indigenous women have argued that after they've given birth to one child, they have been forcibly sterilized by nurses and doctors. So, biopolitics is a term designed to capture the collective governance of humans that Foucault argues only became possible with the emergence of population and populations. So, biopolitics is a form of governance that involves intervening into the life of a population. It involves intervening into people's actual bodies. And this form of governance is concerned with population, with counting the population, with trying to determine who is part of the population of any country or city or place. Biopolitical strategies from birth control programs to social security to genocide often exist alongside disciplinary programs designed to normalize individuals and generate uniform, disciplined bodies of citizens. But they work at a different level, since their target is neither the individual nor the political collectivity, but rather the more or less biologized entity that is population. So, what's interesting about biopolitics is that it isn't just about capitalism. A lot of public policies, a lot of strategies used by the government, like housing policies or student debts are really about money. And so if you have enough money, you are often a really privileged person who is guaranteed certain things. But biopolitics is really about the population and who is part of the population. And biopolitics is often a really disturbing form of modern racism. So trying to control who has children and trying to control the health of the population, supporting the health and the future births of certain groups of people is often not a philosophy or set of ideas that corresponds with modern capitalism. And this is why instances of contemporary biopolitics are often really scary, such as forced sterilization. Um, Medical racism is also another form of biopolitics that is often really disturbing and does not uh, really exist within other aspects of modern capitalism. So, war waged by a sovereign against a political enemy may well inflict large scale death, but it is qualitatively different, Foucault argues, from the kind of 20th century warfare waged on behalf of and in the name of a race or a people. Biopolitics has in recent years become another successful cookie cutter, with proliferating examples of biopolitics being uncovered within the sociology of health and medicine, postcolonial studies, and in theory circles generally. Here, however, we will limit our discussion to biopolitics' relationship to discipline and the reasons for the relative dearth of biopolitical citations in criminological literature. So obviously, hate crimes And hate crimes using the medical system or any aspect of health involve this logic of biopolitics. And medical racism is a form of crime or a kind of way of committing crime that is extremely disturbing. And it has these allusions to Nazism. So using one's position as a nurse or doctor to sterilize Indigenous women without their consent is similar to the kind of genocidal policies used by the Nazis. So I'll play a clip um, about the sterilization of Indigenous women. And the class action lawsuits continue, but obviously what nurses and doctors who are accused of these crimes would argue is that they were doing their jobs and that Indigenous women did consent to being sterilized. This is why these cases have gone to court. So over 80 Indigenous women allege coerced sterilization in a class action lawsuit against Canadian healthcare providers.
Ford employee pricing is on now.
Where you pay, what we pay.
When you can get my price on this Bronco Sport.
Or this Bronco.
What's not to love? It's here now, but not for long.
Calls are growing louder for a public inquiry into allegations of coerced sterilization of Indigenous women. There's a long and gruesome history of this practice in Canada, but a new class action lawsuit alleges it happened as recently as last year. The lawsuit involves over 80 women so far. This week, a prominent First Nations leader called the issue a crisis. Some of the accusations are nothing short of horrifying.
A social worker came in and that's when she told me, we want you to have a tubal ligation. And I didn't want it. And I told her no. And then that's when she's like, well, we don't want you leaving us hospital until it's done.
That's Brenda Pelche saying she was badgered by nurses to sign a consent form only moments after she gave birth. Others say they were lied to, told the sterilization process could be reversed. We know in some cases, sterilization happens under the guise of concerns over family planning. In 2017, the Saskatoon Health Region acknowledged some of these allegations and apologized. There are laws protecting people from forced procedures, but experts say that isn't enough. And joining me to talk about all of this is Vice Chief of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, Heather Baer. So, Heather, you've spoken to a lot of Indigenous women about what they say happened to them. What do you want to see done?
Well, first of all, I think we need to put an end to it. We need to compensate. We need to address and see what supports these women need. And of course, we need to look at making sure it doesn't happen again. And I'd like to see, the criminalization of this practice happen so that there is a stronger deterrent because, the criminal code as is not working. So I think we need to revisit that. And I would like to, call on, our senators, for example, to, support a bill to amend the Criminal Code of Canada, to criminalize sterilization of Indigenous women and girls.
Can you tell me about a case in particular that struck you?
Well, they all strike me as very disturbing. But I know in one case, a woman was begging for them to stop, and she could literally, smell the fire as she was her tubes were being cauterized, and it just a thought, and to imagine that happening, and her despair and the pain.
Is it true that you've heard that some women have been told that they can't see their babies unless they've
Oh, yes.
signed that piece of paper?
It's just dreadful and just heart-wrenching to hear, how nurses and professionals could be so uncompassionate and disrespectful of the desires and, when it comes to how our people are treated. Not only with this issue, but other issues. But right now, this is a critical issue that needs to be addressed immediately and condemned.
The Prime Minister speaks often of his commitment to righting wrongs for Indigenous people. Has he been supportive?
Well, I've heard it condemned, but like I say, for our Indigenous people, justice, she is not blind, and that's where I'm kind of drawing the line here in terms of, what people say, what people do is more important, and I think he has the power to make government accountable and the people accountable for this heinous, disturbing, repulsive crimes against our women.
Board employee pricing.
So I'll post the slides online with the video clips as well, so you can look at them. And if you're interested in looking at these issues for your presentation or your final assignment or future graduate level study, these are ongoing lawsuits that will obviously go on and involve the healthcare system throughout Canada. So these are really topical issues for graduate level study or for law school proposals. So biopolitics then is a way of governing, and biopower for Foucault involves techniques of governance. So the ways that people go about trying to intervene in life. And obviously there are positive legal uses of interventions into life, like warning on cigarette packages or nutritional content value, but intervening into people's bodies without their consent when they're trying to have children is obviously against the law. So in its most benign and useful form, biopower, the techniques the state uses to intervene into life, will promote the health of the public and will offer the public proper information that they can choose to use to prolong their lives or our lives, or choose to ignore. But in its most extreme, biopolitics can veer towards Nazism and towards genocide. So the term governmentality is also from Michel Foucault. And there is a relationship between governmentality and this idea of the panopticon, which is the kind of all-seeing power of the state to put us under surveillance. So for Foucault, it is actual practices of governance that are the object of analysis, not generalized notions such as discipline that have much heuristic utility but are inherently oversimplified. So there is no one-to-one relation then between technique and discipline, between power and knowledge, and between person and state for Foucault. Governmentality is not just the government. It is a way that ideas of government and state power extend across institutions. So there is an infinitesimal, way in which institutional power affects us, which is why Foucault is also interested in norms and normativity and the internalization of norms. So there are many important ideas to take from Foucault, and I think this is just a kind of reading of this article that draws on Foucault. And Foucault's scholarship is obviously massive, but some of the key ideas that I think are important to take from Foucault in the context of criminological theory, firstly, is about security. Unlike discipline, security or sécurité, which is a French concept from Foucault, actually allows for freedom. You're free to move around in a city, but the city has surveillance cameras. You are free to make mistakes and to spend money in ways that might not be advisable, but you must pay your bills, and if you go into too much debt, then you could have serious problems, including problems with the law. So this is security, and security actually then offers freedom only to the extent that there is surveillance. Other ideas from Foucault that are of interest is the idea of the panopticon. The panopticon, I think, is one of the most useful ideas for criminology because a panopticon is a kind of structure that allows people to be put under surveillance. So the term panopticon for Foucault is really about the prison. So the panopticon is the design of an institutional building, and it's also a system of control. And this idea originated with Jeremy Bentham, who is an English philosopher. So for Foucault, the panopticon is a metaphor rather than an actual prison, and it allows Foucault to explore the relationship between social control and people in institutions. And so rather than thinking about the prison itself, what interests Foucault is the way that the idea of the prison is actually multiplied and appears in various forms across institutions of power. So one does not need to be in prison to be under social control or to feel as though one could go to jail. In our time period, the police and the existence of police and police murder are perhaps a more terrifying reality than the prison industrial complex as an idea. So rather than just thinking about jail and one could be imprisoned, people now fear actually being killed by the state. And so this is kind of a more intense form of panopticanism, or a more intense kind of idea of the panopticon as that which forces us to live as if we are unfree or not free. So the final concept is homo sacer, and homo sacer is a concept from Giorgio Agamben. This is another clip of David from the Theory and Philosophy blog discussing homo sacer.
Hey everyone, back again. Today I'm going to talk about Giorgio Agamben's idea or notion of Homo sacer. Now, before jumping into that, if you want to follow me anywhere other than here, you can find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy or on Twitter at David Guignot. If you're new here, welcome. I'm David. I try to explain philosophical texts and ideas in a way that makes them accessible to help you along your philosophical journey. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe. I'd love to see you back. If you want to help me out, you can do that by simply subscribing, liking, sharing, telling your friends, commenting, all that stuff. We gotta pump that algorithm a little bit. If you're listening to this in podcast form, you'll be able to find the video on YouTube. If you found this on YouTube, you'll be able to find this in podcast form anywhere where you get podcasts where there shouldn't be any ads, at least for now. If you are listening to this in podcast form, perhaps on Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars would help me out a lot. And yeah, you can help me out via Patreon or PayPal if you want to, but obviously no pressure. And I don't want to waste any more of your time with that stuff. Let's talk about Homo sacer, which is a complicated term, and I want to be quite upfront. I'm not going to be able to discuss every single part of this, especially the history of the term that Agamben is drawing from. You really have to read the entire book, Homo sacer, or sacer, whatever, for that. I'm just going to give you kind of a bare bones understanding of it to get your feet off the ground, essentially, and open up some possible criticisms I have of it and some of the ways that it informs perhaps Foucauldian notions of biopolitics or works against them to some extent as well. So let's jump into it. Now, at the core of the term Homo sacer is a kind of ambivalence. And the reason that there's an ambivalence is because sacer quite literally can refer to sacred. And when we think of sacred, we probably think someone who's exalted, maybe they're held in high esteem. But the tradition and the language, etymologically, that Agamben is drawing from actually paints the notion of sacredness or sacer in this way in a kind of negative light as well, where someone who was considered to be sacred or sacer was someone that could also be seen as being like dirty, like someone you weren't supposed to come in contact with, someone that could actually be like ostracized from the political order. Now, the reason he's digging into this question of sacredness is because, and he's really speaking to Walter Benjamin here, and the kind of question that Walter Benjamin opens about the sacredness of life in relation to divine law and what divine law might mean. And I've done an episode on Benjamin's text, The Critique of Violence, which you can find and check out on here if you want. But Agamben is really curious about this because there's been a kind of naive assumption that sacredness, is referring to something that is held in high esteem, something that is seen as being something to protect. Now, Agamben shows, because it is also associated with this kind of notion of being dirty, this image of dirtiness, that they are someone who has to be excluded. Now, that serves a very instrumental function for Agamben in constituting a political order, but we're gonna get there in a minute. We're gonna build here and arrive to that point. But that is essentially the end goal that Agamben wants to arrive at. So Homo sacer is a person, is a human, who is both beneath the law and outside of the law. That is, they are someone whose life can't be used to propitiate, which is a fancy word for saying that cannot feed or cannot be sacrificed, is someone whose life can't mean anything really for those people in authority, for the dominant social order. So, for example, they are so beneath life, they are so beneath citizenship, let's say, especially as we're referring to this in relation to the Roman tradition that he's really picking up on here, and the Greeks as well. Homo sacer is someone who is beneath citizenship, and so their life means nothing in terms of a sacrificial order. So you cannot sacrifice a Homo sacer with the hope of getting something from the gods, like have your crops grow or something like that. They are seen as being less than that. At the same time, they are also someone whose life means nothing, even if they're killed. So if you were to kill one of these people, or if they were to be killed, what that would mean was that nothing would befall you because it was like you weren't even killing a human. So their lives couldn't be sacrificed to the gods, and their lives meant like nothing within the political order, which is very strange considering our perhaps immediate understanding of what a sacred person is. But historically, as Agamben shows, they are someone whose life could neither be used to propitiate the gods, nor could be seen as being something worth defending or punishing if they were to be killed by someone else. So the person who killed them couldn't be punished. Now, the emergence of this kind of figure, this person that can be killed with impunity, essentially, where nothing bad will happen, it can only come about in a certain phase, a certain stage, a certain kind of mode of social organization, one that Agamben attributes specifically to the emergence of sovereign power, because it is the sovereign who has the capacity to kill without that killing being in the service of anything so-called meaningful in terms of a sacrificial order, or the killing being something that could then be retribution can be paid for it in the form of disciplinary measures or whatever. So the sovereign is the person who is given the potential, given the, I guess, authority to kill without committing homicide, and to, in that same act of killing, do it without it meaning anything in a sacrificial way. Because in the case of like a sacrifice, that person would hardly, the executioner would hardly be someone considered to have committed a homicide, because it is part of that social order as being something that is approved, allowed for. Now in this phase, because, or this kind of mode of social organization, in this social sphere, people are viewed as being less than, these specific people are viewed as being less than worthy to sacrifice, and so they can be killed with impunity. Now, at this point, they are reduced to what Agamben calls, and what he draws from etymologically, they are reduced to a kind of bare life, where all they are is a living being. And because they are only a living being, they're just flesh, essentially, they don't actually have any real meaning. And so they can be killed with absolutely no consequence. And so even though something, a person, is held as being sacred, and we know now that that sacredness is not something to really be excited about, it serves a pretty instrumental function in that it is a necessary part of the establishment of sovereign power. So in that sense, it is kind of sacred. It's a necessary component and something we must strive for if we want to establish this kind of social organization, which is obviously not a great one. But these people are held in a kind of strange inverse exaltation where they are seen as being a necessary component of this system, precisely because they can be taken out of that system via killing without any kind of repercussion. Now, this is how Agamben establishes his own form of biopolitics, where people are reduced to a kind of life only. And it is in that moment that they can then be killed without any kind of repercussions occurring. Now, this is both similar and different from the kind of biopolitics we get in Foucault, because Foucault doesn't pay quite as much attention to this possibility of death coming from this focus on life. In fact, he considers more about what the proliferation of life means in terms of power. Whereas Agamben is saying this proliferation of life, this acknowledgement of things as life, has pretty negative consequences, because then it strips people of anything beyond their flesh, because it strips them of anything beyond their zoe, being the term he draws upon here, anything other than their just their lifeness. They don't have any kind of meaning beyond that. And that's a very scary moment, because it reduces people to that, just their biology, which houses no meaning in itself. Now, he uses the example of the Holocaust to also illustrate this, where the Jewish people, among other people at the time, were reduced to this kind of bare life. They had their rights taken, citizenship taken, everything like that, and reduced to only life. And he calls this a form of biopolitics in that way. And he says that obviously opened the door for this thing called the Holocaust, for that event that is still very much unimaginable, that still occurred. Now, there's an issue that I have with this, just to give my own input, in that he reduces the Holocaust to like a kind of teleological inevitability to this thing called sovereign power and bare life. And while that may be true, in that we have certainly set the conditions for these types of events to occur, and they have occurred all across the world in terms of as a result of this kind of sovereign power that he sketches, I think that he is too quick not to see the specificity of an event like the Holocaust as representing something more than just a kind of teleological consequence of this form of sovereign power, in that there were so many other historical situations that played a part, like the historical treatment of Jewish people certainly contributed to this. It wasn't just any people, and we can't lose sight of that fact. Like the treatment of the Jewish people all throughout the world for thousands of years contributed to this as well. This is not just the demonstration of a kind of sovereign power that did this because it could. It was a sovereign power that also had these other baked in prejudices. And I think that Agamben downplays that to some extent. And that is really it. There's, to give you kind of basic introduction, there's not really much more to add than that. But of course, you get a lot more if you actually read the text. But yeah, if anyone, you listen this far, I'd love to hear what anyone else had to say, what you think might be worth adding. If anyone puts a comment in, that's really good. I love pinning them, so that everyone can see anything that should be added. Or if I mischaracterized anything, I'd love to hear about it. But yeah, if you like what I did here, leave 5 stars, like, share, review, and catch you next time. Take care.
So biopolitics then is described in this article in relation to this concept of homo sacer. So if biopolitics then allows the state to intervene into life using techniques of biopower, which could involve forms of eugenics that are against the law and historically have even been used to enact genocide, then the homo sacer emerges as a possible figure in our time. So Agamben is interested in using this term homo sacer to discuss the ways that a sovereign power, say a king or a great aristocrat, a dictator, can kill a common person. So the kind of off with their head idea of pre-modern societies when there was no rule of law or democracy creates these people who are commoners who can be killed by the king. So what's of interest to Agamben and others who use this term homo sacer and his other writings about bare life is to consider the creation of these figures who can be killed with impunity in our time period. So the existence of refugees and non-status migrants, asylum seekers, is something Agamben discusses in his work. Who is allowed to stay in a certain country, who is allowed to flee from persecution or whose persecution is taken seriously is really a matter of life and death. So homo sacer, I think, is an interesting concept in relation to crime because the state then is an arbiter of rights, but also the state can take life from a person. And police violence and the extrajudicial killing of people by police in North America has gained global attention and led to mass protests. So this is, I think, a useful concept in considering crime in this time period and considering how the state can, in many ways, commit crimes every day, specifically against certain populations. So I'll finish with this quote: people know what they do. Frequently, they know why they do what they do. but what they don't know is what they do does. So Foucault is really interested in the far-reaching effects of power in our lives. So that is the lecture, and that is the second part of the lecture. I hope that you're enjoying the class. I will post the lecture and the PowerPoint slides online. Thank you.